Robin, this is Bruce. I assume that the pre-game chatter was enough to affirm we've got good volume.
Yes, everybody sounded great that was talking. And so far I've heard everybody speak and everybody sounded great. Just a reminder to the presenters to make sure that your phones are turned off and anything that might chime or whatever on your computer while you're speaking. So just be aware of that.
Great, thank you. Do you want us to mute before the...
You should be muted until it's time for you to talk, Tim.
Okay,
Yep.
And that isn't going to happen until the Q&A session.
When it's time to talk, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, thanks. I'm going to mute now.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Section 508 Best Practice webinar series. My name is Robin Jones, and I'll be running through a few of the logistics before the start of today's session, before we turn it over to our presenters. Sign language interpreter, you're going to sign for me? Thank you. We're going to just run through some of the instructions about the webinar platform itself before we get started. First of all is looking at the webinar sign-in process itself. Notice that many of you are signed in with a first name only, or an initial, or a company name, or an acronym or something. Please note that we will not be able to give you credit for attending today's session unless we are able to match up your name with your registration information. This is the only way that we can verify participation. If you don't know what your profile looks like, you can send us a message in the chat area and we can verify it for you. Or you can send us an email at webinars@adaconferences.org with your name and we can match it up there as well. Just a note again that we are not able to give you credit unless we are able to verify your name. Zoom webinar does not allow you the same option to rename yourself that Zoom meetings does, unfortunately. The webinar platform interface shows the whiteboard where our PowerPoint presentation will appear today. Audio controls are in the lower left-hand corner. The chat icon is where we will have doing instructions or verifying your name. The Q&A icon is what you will be using to submit questions to the speakers. And the CC closed captioning icon will be used if you want to turn on and off the closed captioning or view the full transcript for today's session. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll have the option to leave the webinar. You can always sign back in if once you've left. And in the upper right-hand corner is your option to adjust your view, full screen view and viewing area. That only affects your view, not the view of others. Listen today and on your computer, make sure you've checked your speaker settings and such. Please note that in addition to your own computer settings, Zoom controls your sound to some degree. So you may want to check if you're still having problems by opening up the audio settings and checking your speaker volume and such in the Zoom platform itself. You can also, in the future, download and view from the app on your mobile device, such as from Apple Store or from Google Play. You also can always join the session by opening the session link in a browser on your mobile device as well. There was an option to listen by telephone today, and the numerous telephone options were provided in the reminder email that was sent to everyone. So if you're having difficulty with sound today, you could switch to the telephone if that might provide you a better audio experience. Real-time captioning is being provided in both Zoom as well as StreamText external link. You make your own choice as how you want to utilize this based on your preference. The StreamText link was provided in the chat area. If you're using StreamText, you will need to open a separate browser to view the captioning and resize your screen to be able to view them side by side in a desktop computer. Zoom offers the option to mouse over and move the captioning box anywhere on the screen to customize your view as well. And within Zoom, you can choose to view the full transcript by mousing over the CC icon and selecting the View Full Transcript option. We are using Video Sign Language Interpreter today. It's being provided via Video Spotlight. There are 2 sign language interpreters. They will be swapping their images as they switch interpreters during the session. This may cause a brief pause or interruption in the sign language, but we'll try to minimize that as best we can. You can change your view for the sign language interpreter on your desktop, laptop, computer by choosing the Swap Video and Shared Screen option from your Viewing Options menu. On a tablet and phone option for viewing the video will differ depending on the device that you are using. This just gives you a sample of how to do the change screen view in the full video image on your screen. And also to enlarge the image of the sign language interpreter, mouse over the edge of the video box, and once the double-ended sword arrow appears, stretch the image to the desired size. We will be taking questions for today through the Q&A area, and you can submit either anonymously or with your name. You have that option when you submit. Do not submit questions in the chat area. We will not be monitoring this for questions, and we will not be conveying those questions to the presenters. We also ask you to refrain from using and having any commentary or responses in the chat area, as it distracts others. Only use it for verifying your name or for getting instructions from us. If you're listening on the phone and you're not actually on the webinar platform itself, we'll also take your questions through email, and you can email us at webinars@adaconferences.org. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, send a message in the chat area and we will respond to you, and or send an email to webinars@adaconferences.org. At this time, we'll prepare for our presentation.
Hello, welcome to this month's edition of the CIOC Section 508 Best Practices webinar. This webinar is part of a series showcasing best practices in federal Section 508 implementation. It is archived at www.adaconferences.org/CIOC/archives. A best practice is a policy, process, procedure, or technique proven effective over time and repeatable by multiple agencies. It is generalized so that diverse agencies may use it in their own organization, but specific enough to provide useful guidance and instruction. The CIO Council Accessibility Community Practice has published a library of Section 508 best practices, which may be viewed at www.section508.gov. Next slide. We're now on slide 2. Slide 2, Section 508 Best Practices webinars. They're bi-monthly. They're held in January, this webinar in March, then May, July, September, and November. The next webinar in this series will be May 25th, and it will be on Section 508 compliance and assistive technology, providing accessibility to ICT for federal employees under the Rehabilitation Act, Sections 504 and 508. It will be held at the same time, 1 to 2:30 Eastern Time. Next slide, slide 3. This webinar is brought to you by the U.S. Access Board. The logo is a red, white, and blue star surrounded by the words United States Access Board, and also the CIO Council, which is the word CIO Council surrounded by a circle of blue stars and a further circle of gray stars. Next slide, slide 4. We are now at the title slide for today's presentation. It is the review of the revised 508 standards, Part 2, Requirements for Hardware and Software. Today's presenters will be Bruce Bailey, myself, Timothy Cregan, and Kathy Ang. We are all colleagues. We are part of the 508 team at the U.S. Access Board. This is part of the Section 508 Best Practices webinar series, and this is the second in a series of 2 webinars reviewing the 508 standards. Next slide, please. Slide 5. Slide 5, we were covering today's agenda. Today's agenda will be in 6 parts. The first part of the agenda is going to cover briefly the accessibility standards, which will be Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act as revised in 2017, and the WCAG 2.0 success criteria and conformance requirements. Then we will talk about examples of accessible hardware, known as Stationary ICT. Then our third section, we will answer questions about hardware. And the primary question, of course, is always, is it covered by Section 508? And what is closed functionality, and how do the 508 standards address it? Finally, we will look at accessible software applications in Section 4. And then we will finish up with questions and answers submitted by you, the audience. And finally, we will have resources So those are the 6 sections of today's agenda. And with that, we're going to start in our next slide, slide 6, which is Accessibility Standards, section 508, and the WCAG 2.0 success criteria. Slide 7, section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 2017. So the first thing we need to know is that we talk about defined terms in the first provision, E103.4, ICT and IT. ICT is information and communication technology. So within the definition of ICT, it says information technology, which itself is a defined term, and other equipment, systems, technologies, or processes for which the principal function is the creation, manipulation, storage, display, receipt, or transmission of electronic data and information, as well as any associated content. Examples include, but are not limited to, computers and peripheral equipment, information kiosk and transaction machines, telecommunications equipment, software applications, websites. I would just like to take a moment to note that IT, information technology, is part of the definition of ICT. And IT is found and defined at 40 U.S. Code 111.01 subsection 6. Now, on the next slide, let's take a further look at that. Slide 9, the Klinger-Cohen Act of 1996. That is the name of the original law, and it's found at 40 U.S. Code 111.01.6. This law is updated periodically. What you see before you is taken from the definition section. So information technology, it means any equipment or interconnected system or subsystem of equipment used in the automatic acquisition, storage, analysis, evaluation, manipulation, management, movement, control, display, switching, interchange, transmission, or reception of data or information by the executive agency, if it's used directly by the agency or if it's used by a contractor under a contract that requires the use of the equipment. It also includes computers, ancillary equipment, including peripherals and peripheral equipment designed to be controlled by the central processing unit of a computer. So you see that this IT, information technology definition from Klinger-Cohen, is itself incorporated into the larger definition of ICT, which is very important for our analysis and consideration of what is ICT. Now, going forward, we look at more defined terms. Defined terms are found in E103.4. Important for today's discussion, the definitions for hardware and for keyboards. Hardware is a tangible device, equipment, or physical component of ICT. A keyboard is a systematically arranged alphanumeric set of keys and tactily discernible keys. So next slide, further definitions. Operable parts and TTYs. An operable part is a hardware-based user control for activating, deactivating, or adjusting ICT. Keep in mind that today's presentation, we will be talking about hardware and software. So it's very important that we remember when we define certain terms, how they apply and what they mean. So an operable part is the terminology used when you're discussing hardware and its functions. A TTY is equipment that enables interactive text-based communications through the transmission of frequency shift keying audio tones across the publicly switched telephone network, PTSN. This includes devices for real-time text and voice and text intermixed communications. Examples include voice carryover, hearing carryover, and you may have a computer with TTY emulating software and a modem. I mention this because, again, throughout today's discussions, there will be provisions that apply to hardware and provisions that apply to software, and people will look at, well, what functions are being accomplished here? And so it's very important to understand what environments you're operating in as to how those are analyzed. So next slide, please. E206 hardware, what's covered? Okay, so the 508 standards are set up so that first you have definitions. Does your defined term comport with what you're dealing with? Secondly, what are the scoping requirements for that defined term? So in this case, in Chapter 2, E206 Hardware, you have scoping requirements that talk about where components of ICT are hardware and they transmit information or they have a user interface. They shall conform to the technical requirements in Chapter 4. So we have scoping provisions. And now on this next slide, slide 13, we have Chapter 4 hardware. These are the technical requirements that are applied. So all the chapters are set up numerically in order. So we have the 401, the general provisions for the chapter, and the scoping says the requirements of Chapter 4 shall apply to ICT, that is hardware, where required by 508 Chapter 2. Remember, we just saw those scoping requirements, and were otherwise referenced in any other chapter of the revised 508 standards. The one exception is that hardware that is assistive technology shall not be required to conform to the requirements of this chapter. Okay, continuing on, slide 14. We're giving the Chapter 4 has the largest number of requirements in the 508 standards. It goes all the way up to 415. So what you see on this slide is an overview of the provisions 402 to 409. And we will discuss some of this in greater detail today. 402 is closed functionality, which means that it is ICT, that is hardware, that is intended to be operated without attaching assistive technology to it. The sole exception would be something like a kiosk, which has provisions for a earphone jack to be added. Otherwise, nothing else. You can't add software to it, for example, to make it accessible. So anyway, there'll be more discussion about that in a moment. 403 biometrics, 404 preservation of information provided for accessibility, such as captioning and so forth, 405 privacy, 406 standard connections, 407 operable parts, 408 display screens, and 409 status indicators. These are the first 9 provisions in Chapter 4 hardware. Moving on to the next slide, slide 15. Here are the remainder of the technical provisions addressed in Chapter 4. 410 addresses color coding, 411 audible signals, 412 ICT with two-way voice communication, 413 is closed caption processing technologies, 414 is audio description processing technologies, and 415 is the user controls for captions and audio descriptions. Okay, that is Chapter 4. Moving on to the next slide, slide 16. We're back to definitions for software, which is addressed further. The technical requirements are found in Chapter 5. So a defined term for software is program, procedures, rules, and related data and documentation that directs the use and operation of ICT and instruct it to perform a given task or function. It includes, but is not limited to, applications, non-web software, and platform software. Okay, so we read this and we're sitting here going, okay, so what is an application? What is non-web software? And what is platform software? Application itself is defined, and it's defined as software designed to perform or help a user to perform a particular task. Okay, non-web software is defined as software that is not a web page, it is not embedded in a web page, and it is not used in the rendering or functioning of web pages. All right, moving on, slide 17 goes on to further define platform software. It is software that interacts with hardware or provides services for other software. A single software component may have both platform and non-platform aspects. It may run or host other software, and it may isolate other software from the underlying software or hardware. For example, desktop operating systems are an example of platform software. Embedded operating systems, including mobile systems, are examples of platform software. Web browsers, plugins to web browsers that render particular media or file formats. These are all examples of platform software, such as sets of components, such as applications supporting macros description. Again, all of these are examples of what is platform software. Now, having gone through the definitions for software, we move on to slide 18 and we are into the scoping provisions. E207 software. So what is covered in the software provisions? Where components of ICT are software and transmit information or have a user interface, they shall conform to E207 and Chapter 5. The exception for that is software that is assistive technology and supports the accessibility services of the platform. Also in the scoping provisions, E207.2, WCAG conformance. User interface components, the content of platforms and applications shall conform to WCAG 2.0 Level A and AA success and conformance requirements. Continuing the software scoping provisions on Chapter 19, slide 19, the next slide, we also look at the exceptions under WCAG conformance. Again, the exception here is, first of all, software that is assistive technology and supports the accessibility services of a platform does not need to conform to E207. Secondly, non-web software does not need to conform to the following 4 success criteria. All 4 of these success criteria address collections or groups or multiple web pages, which is why they don't apply to something that's non-web software. And it's 2.4.1 bypass blocks, 2.4.5 multiple ways, 3.2.3 consistent navigation, and 3.2.4 consistent identification. Non-web software finally need not conform to what is called conformance requirement number 3, complete processes in WCAG. In the WCAG success criteria and provisions, there is a section on conformance requirements, and this particular requirement is called out as an exception and does not apply to non-web software. Finally, you have slide 13, Chapter 4, hardware. These are the technical requirements that apply to hardware. As with all of our technical chapters, you start off with a scoping statement that tells you where the provisions of this chapter apply. So it applies to hardware as defined previously, and where it was scoped previously. It's important to note that hardware that is assistive technology is not required to conform to the requirements of this chapter. Next slide, slide 14. Chapter 4 hardware is the longest chapter in the 508 standards. It has 15 provisions. What I'm going to do in these next 2 slides is just give you a quick overview of some of the hardware technical requirements that are covered. 402, closed functionality, is probably the most significant one we're going to discuss today. Think of any ICT to which you cannot add assistive technology. So all you can add is earphone jacks, and that's it. You can't add any software or anything else to make it accessible. Another important provisions are 407, operable parts, and these again are all part of the provisions that address hardware. Next slide, we're moving on to slide 15. The last of the hardware provisions are 410 to 415, and these cover color coding, which is very important, audible signals, which is separate from ICT with two-way voice communication. Think of telecommunications, that is two-way voice communication. Then we also talk about closed captioning and audio description, not only the processing technologies themselves, but the user controls associated with them. That takes us through the end of chapter 4 through the provisions. Moving on to next slide, slide 16, we're going to talk about defined terms for software. So software and non-web software are two of the terms we're going to be talking about today that are very important to be defined. These are found in E103.4, and software is program, procedures, rules, and related data and documentation that directs the use and operation of ICT and instruct it to perform a given task or function. It includes applications, which is designed as software that is designed to perform or help the user perform a particular task. And finally, there's non-web software that's not a web page. Now, moving on, we're talking about platform software, which is software that interacts with hardware or provides services for other software. Examples of platform software include desktop operating systems, embedded operating systems, and web browsers. Moving on to slide 18, E207 software. Again, just like with hardware, we have scoping provisions. And the scoping provisions for software say that it applies to ICT that meets the definition of software and transmits information or has a user interface. And there is an exception for software that is assistive technology. In addition, software should conform with WCAG 2.0. It should conform with the WCAG 2.0 level A and double A success criteria and conformance requirements. Moving on, the scoping provisions for software are continued. There are exceptions for the application of WCAG, so it doesn't apply to software that acts as assistive technology. And also, a non-web software, which was defined previously, doesn't need to conform to success criteria for multiple web pages. Moving on, Chapter 5, Software. These are the technical requirements for software, and these define where and when software must conform to these requirements. So if it's required to conform by Chapter 2 and where it's otherwise referenced in the standards, it must comply with Chapter 5. Chapter 5 has 3 provisions: interoperability with assistive technology, applications, and authoring tools. There is an exception for web applications that do not have access to platform accessibility services. Moving on to the next slide. Slide 21, WCAG 2.0 success criteria, a brief overview. WCAG 2.0 on slide 23 is referred to as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It is organized into three levels. It is principles, guidelines, and success criteria. The most common information that we face are these success criteria, which are in 3 levels: level A, AA, and AAA. What we focus on are the success criteria in level A and AA, which are the detailed technical requirements for conformance. So you can read more about this at http://w3.org/w3.org/tr/WCAG20. So moving on, we are now on slide 23. Slide 23 shows WCAG 2.0 incorporation by reference. And what we have is a graphic of the 508 rule, and then intersecting with it is another circle which represents WCAG 2.0. And the point of intersection is the WCAG 2.0 level A and AA success criteria, which are incorporated by reference into the 508 standards. Next slide. Finally, it is incorporated by reference in slide 24, as we note, and it's broadly applied. It's an international standard. It is also used for accessible web pages within the European standard, which is referred to as EN 301549. It's mandate 376. There are a wealth of guidance materials, which are found at w3.org/WAI. Finally, just as a reminder, WCAG is organized into 4 principles: POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, which talks to the characteristics that the provisions address, that the success criteria look to. All right, now that we've gone over those technical requirements, we're going to move on to part 2 of our presentation, which is examples of accessible hardware. We're going to talk about stationary ICT. This is in chapter 4. Next slide. Stationary ICT. Within chapter 4, we have a provision 407 on operable parts. A subsection of operable parts is reach, height, and depth. And what it does is it addresses characteristics of what is known as freestanding ICT. Now, what you see on the slide is a photograph or picture of a copier, printer, faxer, very large machine for high volumes of work. This device is put in place and it is not intended to be moved. These criteria are most useful to product manufacturers, but it's also important for considering when you're installing such a product. When you look to these products, what you keep in mind is that in the criteria, imagine that the product is fronted by something called a vertical reference plane. So what that means is as you approach the ICT, you imagine that all of the controls and keys are available to you in relation to an invisible vertical reference plane from which you measure all your interactions with the device. So next slide. Next slide, slide 28, 407.8. It's reach, height, and depth. Now, this is part of a series of 11 images in the reach section. These are included in our online copy of the 508 standards. They're illustrative only. The illustrations are not the controlling factor here. What is the controlling factor is the language of the provision itself. But what we need to be aware of is that each of the operable parts of the stationary ICT, the controls, the switches, whatever it is that you're doing, have to be installed at a height conforming to the provisions in this section. And now I'd just like to turn over the second part of the slide to my colleague, Bruce Bailey, who can speak a little bit to our experiences in hardware. Bruce?
Thank you, Tim. This is Bruce Bailey. I'm an IT specialist at the Access Board, and I wanted to highlight this provision in particular about operable parts used with speech output should not be the only type of operable part complying with 407.8, because that language, it's a little stilted. But the reason that's in here and is not in previous regulation about accessible self-service transaction machines like we have with ATMs or the FAA has for airline kiosks, and I'll be talking about those a little bit more, is that we've had some kiosk manufacturers who are saying, well, we can keep the touchscreen out of reach if we have these other alternative controls that are within reach. And no, that's not acceptable. If you have a touchscreen that's for somebody who's standing, you need to have the touchscreen within reach for somebody who's operating that touchscreen from a seated position in a wheelchair. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, with that, we're going to move on to our next slide. Okay, so this is an overview of the provisions for reach, height, and depth. And I want to call your attention, these provisions, 407.8.1 through 407.8.3, they talk about different characteristics of ICT that is freestanding. And the intent is that a user who is in a wheelchair or other device, who is approaching the device and who wishes to engage with the controls, what are some of the considerations that the product manufacturers have to keep in mind when designing this product? So remember, you have a vertical reference plane, and you have to consider when someone pulls a wheelchair, for example, alongside of a device, they reach out sideways to the controls and keys. By contrast, they also sometimes pull straight forward at a device and they have a forward reach. So the issues you have to consider are, with reference to the vertical reference plane, where are the controls and keys located, and how is someone going to access them from a side reach and a forward reach? And then, as the other provisions note on this page, sometimes the reaches may be obstructed or they may be unobstructed. So in the next slide, I'd like to illustrate what that means. The reach, height, and depth, we have charts for operable parts, and there is a table explaining all of the requirements for those reaches. Finally, we talk about something called knee and toe spaces under the ICT where you have obstructed forward reach. So next slide. Now, this slide 31. This is an illustration of provision 407.8.1.1, and it talks about the vertical reference plane for side reach. And you'll notice in this image, you see a wheelchair user aligned sideways onto the rectangle representing the freestanding ICT. And within that freestanding ICT is a smaller rectangle which represents the control area. The technical requirements address the distance over which they must reach and where the vertical reference controls must be in reference to the vertical reference plane. Again, all of these are within the 508 standards, which are found on our website. Next slide, please. Okay, 407.8.1.2. This is the vertical reference plane for forward reach. And so again, the issue here, you have forward reach where there's no knee and toe clearance, which means that the controls need to be located at the leading edge of the ICT because the person has to reach a certain distance. So in reference to the vertical reference plane, there's a set of requirements for that. And then also you have a different scenario where knee and toe clearance is provided. So think of a shelf. Someone can roll up to a shelf and their knees and toes are underneath the shelf, and so they can reach deeper into the field. And so the location of the controls may be adjusted accordingly. Again, this is found within the standards. Finally, 402, we have an example of an obstructed side reach. Again, this is slide 33, where it's showing a user who has to reach over an obstruction to reach the controls and keys. And finally, we have the last slide in this series, 34, we have knee and toe space under ICT, where there's an obstructed forward reach. Again, so someone who's rolling up to a counter and they're reaching over it to the controls and keys. This standard addresses all of those design considerations. And with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Kathy Eng, for hardware. Kathy?
Thanks, Tim. We're going to continue to talk about hardware ICT and some of the questions that we've received in our technical assistance inbox. Hardware is one type of 508 ICT that we can physically interact with. So its requirements are different from WCAG and those requirements for software. Hardware is much more difficult to fix when there's a problem. There's a lot more involved in changing a hardware interface than, say, a web or software interface. And manufacturers can't change the location of a button, for example, on a hardware panel and have it available tomorrow for their customers. So it's important to include accessibility requirements during procurement and development of hardware to avoid costly remediations for inaccessibility. Next slide. Okay, slide 36. This is just a reminder of the applicability of Section 508 and its definitions. The first thing that needs to be determined if you're procuring, developing, maintaining, or using something is if it's ICT. And ICT, as just a reminder, is information technology and other equipment, systems, technologies, or processes for which the principal function is the creation, manipulation, storage, display, receipt, or transmission of electronic data and information, as well as any associated content. And once it's determined that it is ICT, we need to determine what kind of ICT. Section 508 has requirements that cover electronic content, hardware, software, and support documentation and services. If the ICT has components that are hardware and transmit information, or hardware and has a user interface, then Chapter 4 hardware of Section 508 will have to be considered. Next slide. Slide 37. Generally, when we receive questions about whether 508 applies to something, 508 usually applies. If the question is being asked, then it's mostly going to be the case that 508 will apply. However, let's break down a few instances where 508 does not apply. On the left of this slide, we have an image of a rack-mounted server system, which you would find in a network closet. This system is most definitely ICT because its principal function is the creation, manipulation, storage, display, transmission of electronic data, and information. However, the metal rack where these servers are installed is not considered ICT because while it is hardware, it does not transmit information and it doesn't have a user interface. So the hardware rack itself would not be covered by 508. On the right side, we have a truck, which you'll find on the highway going down the road. It's a motor vehicle designed to transport cargo. So it does not meet the ICT definition because its principal function is not the creation, manipulation, storage, et cetera, which is the definition of ICT. So while a truck contains hardware, it is not ICT, so 508 doesn't apply to a truck. Next slide. Slide 38. One of the questions we received was, does 508 apply to headsets? And again, we'll go through the analysis. The first question to ask is, are headsets ICT? Headsets transmit or receive data. So yes, headsets are ICT, regardless of whether they are for a computer or telephone. The next question is related to exceptions. The 508 exceptions were covered in other webinars, but these exceptions are legacy ICT, national security systems, federal contracts, maintenance or monitoring spaces, undue burden, or fundamental alteration, and best meets. For the purposes of this webinar and this exercise, none of these exceptions apply. So in the next step in our analysis to determine the type of ICT, so we can determine which 508 requirements will apply. Headsets are hardware, so Chapter 4, hardware, will apply. The specific provisions of Chapter 4, hardware, are applicable based on the features of the ICT hardware. So if the ICT has a display screen, for example, then the requirement for the display screens would apply. But let's use an example of a very basic headset, which is pictured on this slide. It's an over-the-head headphones for both ears with a 3.5 millimeter plug at the end of a long black cord. The most basic of the hardware requirements are 404, preserved info for accessibility, 406, standard connections, 409, status indicators, and 410, color coding. This headset has no status indicators and no color coding, so 409 and 410 would not apply. Only 404 and 406 would apply. Next slide. Slide 39. On this slide, we have more modern headsets that have more features, and more features usually means more 508 requirements. So let's take a look at the example of the headset microphone pictured on the right side of this slide. This is just like the basic headset example on the previous slide, but this is a USB headset instead of the 3.5 millimeter on the earlier example. And this headset includes a microphone and user controls. And those user controls are for mute, volume adjustment, and to make a call or hang up. So because this headset has physical buttons, then the requirement for operable parts applies. And going through each of those 407 operable parts, there's requirements for contrast because there are labels on those buttons. Input controls must be tactily discernible. You need to be able to distinguish these buttons by touch. And for operation, and where at least one mode of operation shall be operable with one hand and shall not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. For another headset example, let's look at the Bluetooth AirPods. These are considered, I guess, emerging technology because these don't have tactile buttons or controls. They're touch operated, where a user could tap on these AirPods to perform a certain function. So because there are controls, the operable parts requirement will apply. However, differently from the earlier headset example that had the physical buttons with character labels, The contrast requirement under operable parts wouldn't apply to the AirPods because there's no label in text. However, tactily discernible could apply because you still would tap on the AirPods. It's just you can tap anywhere. So this would be considered a pass for the tactily discernible requirement. And then the same requirement as before for operation, where at least one mode of operation shall be operable with one hand, would be required for these particular types of headsets. Next slide. Slide 40. So next up for the 508 applicability review is a desktop printer. Here on this slide is a network printer with 3 paper trays that can sit on a table or a desktop. It doesn't matter if one person uses it or if 20 people share this printer. The number of users isn't a 508 factor. So going through the initial analysis to determine 508 applicability, again, we determined that it is ICT and it is hardware that transmits information, and it's hardware that has a user interface. The conformance of most of the hardware provisions can be indicated on a manufacturer's accessibility conformance report, or an ACR. However, it's important to note that when an agency procures ICT with operable parts that they can place on a table or desktop, the agency must ensure that the operable parts are within the Section 508 reach, height, and depth requirements. When an agency procures this desktop printer, for example, the manufacturer's ACR wouldn't be able to indicate conformance to the reach, height, and depth. The agency must conform when they install the printer. So IT support staff should be made aware of these reach requirements. Another requirement that applies to this printer is 402 closed functionality. Closed functionality means that the ICT prevents a user from attaching or installing assistive technology. It has to be operable without a user installing AT. So this means it has to provide the accessibility features itself. 402.2 requires ICT with a display screen to be speech enabled for full and independent use by individuals with vision impairments. This printer has a display, so this requirement applies. Another requirement is information displayed on screen. So the speech output shall be provided for all the information displayed on that screen. There is another requirement for Braille instructions where speech output is required. Braille instructions for initiating the speech mode of operation shall be provided. There are multiple requirements of what needs to be speech output enabled. To meet this requirement, a printer manufacturer can provide speech output on the printer. A user at the printer would then be able to hear the information on the display read out loud. Alternatively, a printer manufacturer can meet this speech output requirement through printer software. While the printer itself is closed functionality, the printer is connected to a computer, which is not closed functionality. This printer software must provide the same information as what is displayed on the actual printer, so a user can access this information from their computer instead of at the physical printer. Bruce will cover more on the software requirements later. Next slide. Slide 41. So we started to hear a lot more recently about augmented and virtual reality. And augmented reality, or AR, is viewable through a headset or a pair of glasses or a smartphone. Augmented reality adds or masks objects in the real world environment, altering a user's reality. AR applications that you may be familiar with include Pokemon Go, or from a furniture store might provide an AR app so that shoppers can see how the furniture will fit in their room before they buy it. Recently, when Perseverance rover landed on Mars, there's an AR app that superimposes images of Mars into your environment so you can test out landing the rover and navigating it around in your kitchen or in your living room. What we have on the left side of this slide is a photo of a tablet using AR to view a warehouse, and the AR overlay marks on the actual warehouse shelves the bins to show directions and locations of items. For virtual reality, this is a computer-generated environment that replaces the user's real world entirely with a simulated environment. VR applications include controlling robots in dangerous locations like space, or for therapy and for training. The photo on the right is an example of virtual reality of a business meeting with 4 avatars. With many of us teleworking and having to meet remotely, this has become probably very popular. And in this example, each avatar represents someone attending the meeting virtually. So someone using this particular VR app could be a 5th person in this meeting who's meeting with these other 4 people in the image. XR is an acronym used to cover all of the hardware, applications, and techniques used for virtual reality or immersive environments, augmented or mixed reality. So XR is really everything that AR, VR, and its associated systems. And XR presents interesting challenges for accessibility, as these are dynamically rendered environments that is rapidly changing, and therefore it needs rich descriptions that are much more than what is currently needed for accessibility in 2D type documents or media. Next slide. Slide 42. The 508 requirements for hardware and software are already existing. So accessibility requirements exist for XR. For emerging technologies and all other ICT, 508 is the minimum requirement for accessibility. And as mentioned earlier, the applicable requirements are dependent on the features of the product, and in this case, on the virtual experience. So review the XR features to determine applicable requirements. If a user can't install assistive technology on the XR hardware, then its closed functionality and speech output is required. But recall that when we discussed the desktop printer, it is possible to utilize computer software and a user's assistive technology to provide the information displayed by the hardware. For operable parts, consider the XR's input controls, contrast on these controls, and reach range. Use similar requirements that you would for evaluating a computer, only in this case, the hardware is different from a computer. The display system can be a smartphone, or it could be virtual reality goggles. In addition, headsets are probably needed for sounds and captions of these of the sounds that a user would hear. And if there are visual indicators, then audio descriptions will be needed. Consider all of the requirements to make the input and the output accessible. If it's not closed functionality, AT can be installed or attached. With AR for a tablet or a phone, then the AT can be used from that device, and then software requirements may apply. On this slide, we have a photo of a woman wearing goggles and holding a handheld controller to modify the virtual model that appears in front of her. Next slide. Slide 43. So wrapping up, here are some XR accessibility resources. The W3C, which is the same organization that developed WCAG, has XR accessibility user requirements. And this document lists user needs and requirements for people with disabilities when using XR. That's available online at www.w3.org/TR/XAUR. The W3C Accessible Platform Architectures Working Group created the Web XR Standards and Accessibility Architectures issues. This is available at www.w3.org, webxr_standards_and_accessibility_architecture_issues. This describes the complex technical architecture and processes behind how XR, which is again virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, and their environments and how they're currently rendered. To help make XR environments accessible and provide a quality user experience, this document explains accessible user interface design and development for the 2D and how it may relate to XR. It also includes some potential solutions for meeting user needs and requirements of people with disabilities. The XRA, which is the XR Association, has members that represent the headset and technology manufacturers across the broad XR industry. The XRA's Developer's Guide, Chapter 3, is about accessibility and inclusive design in immersive experiences. And that's at xra.org/research/XRA-developers-guide-inclusive-design. This includes industry-backed best practices for developing accessible platforms that enhance experiences for all users, not just those with disabilities. And this chapter 3 spells out accessibility techniques to address people with sight, auditory, speech, mobility, and cognitive disabilities. It includes best practices for implementing features and applications that are inclusive, gives users control over their experiences, and reflects input from people with disabilities at all stages of development. And the photo on this slide is of a person wearing mixed reality smart glasses touching a transparent screen. To continue the hardware topic, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce.
This is Bruce Bailey, an IT specialist at the Access Board. On slide 44, please. I'm going to be talking about closed functionality in particular. With the original 508 standards, we talked about self-contained closed products. Next slide, 45. And one of the things I'll mention is that most of these requirements were under the original 508 requirements in year 2000. So I'm talking about self-service kiosks and hardware, closed functionality, as Kathy described for many of the products that she was talking about. So for a kiosk, hardware is going to be the most pertinent requirement. We don't have requirements for kiosks. We don't have requirements for, say, touchscreens, which is one of the things people look for. You know, they look for a heading that says touchscreens. Well, we're functionality oriented, so the requirements we have, the headings we use, are broader than that, because the requirement for closed functionality would apply to a lot of things besides just kiosks. The main items I'm going to be talking about today are 402 closed functionality, in particular speech output enabled. The basic requirement being that ICT with a display screen shall be speech output enabled for full and independent use by people with visual impairments. And 407 operable parts, which Tim talked about a good bit already with some of the reach range stuff. But that would also include contrast, input controls, tactically discernible, single-handed operation, and reach height. And again, Kathy mentioned some of those details when she was talking about products. And then finally, 409 status indicators, that they shall be discernible visually and by touch or sound. Next slide, 46. I do want to mention at my start here that the speech output enabled requirement includes 6 significant exceptions. The first one being that variable message size conforming to 402.5. That's a reference to an external standard about size and visibility of variable message size, that they're not required to be speech out enabled. So we're not requiring, if you have a digital only sign, we're not requiring that you add speech to that. But 402.5 gives the external reference to a third-party publication that has extensive description of the visibility. Our second exception to this part is that speech output shall not be required where ICT display screens only provide status indicators, and those indicators conform to 409. 409 being the requirements for how you can discern something visually or discern something by touch without operating it. Exception 3 is where speech output cannot be supported due to constraints in available memory or processor capability, that ICT shall be permitted to conform to 409 in lieu of 402.2. And that also gets at the situation where Kathy described with like a printer. It might be impossible for that printer to have speech output and an operating system and controls that supported the speech output. But maybe you can have the physical controls that apply for it, or the alternative way of having the software provide the equivalent functions and features. Fourth exception, that audible tone shall be permitted instead of speech output where the content of user input is not displayed as entering for security purposes. So that's for if you're, for example, in a situation with an ATM or putting in a password, if there's going to be voice output, you would rather that say asterisk or star and not the actual numbers you're entering. Exception 5, that speech output should not be required for machine location date. And a few other details. Again, that is inherited from our work with other requirements for output on accessible ATMs and fare vending machines. Sometimes there's information on screen or on a printed receipt, like the machine location, that you don't really, it's not part of the transaction. It's kind of peripheral information. So we've got a list there. And that ties into item 6, exception 6, speech out should not be required for advertisement and other similar information unless they convey information that can be used for the transaction being conducted. So you don't have to have, if you got a little commercial, it's equivalent to marking that as decorative. Next slide, slide 47, please. I want to highlight 4 of the requirements for the speech output enabled. They're kind of high level. The basic requirement, you've heard me say this once before, ICT with a display screen shall be speech output enabled for full and independent use by individuals with vision impairments. Very broad. And the second item I have highlighted is speech output shall be provided for all information described on screen. Third bullet, where transactional outputs are provided, the speech output shall audibly provide all information necessary to verify a transaction. I mean, that the transaction is presumably the reason you're at the kiosk. And again, this phrasing follows closely from what we have for under the ADA for ATMs and fare vending machines. And finally, speech output shall be coordinated with information displayed on screen. That seems like an obvious no-brainer thing, but you'd be surprised by the number of implementations where there was not, especially in the early days, where there was not coordination between the speech and what was happening on screen. So that's very important and is an explicit requirement. 48. So next slide, please. Also want to mention that for kiosks, chapter 4, again, is the applicable one, that most of these requirements are not new. They were an original 508 from 2000. There isn't a specific requirement about how touchscreens. There's the requirement for the functionality. So the speech output enabled. Kiosk in a federal space has to conform with the 508 requirements. One of the questions we get is like, I'm going to show a picture on the next screen of a federal kiosk. Well, how about we just staff that kiosk with an officer, because the kiosk is not conformant. We don't let these kiosks be out of our sight. We'll just staff an officer there. No, that doesn't work. The kiosk is still non-conformant, even if there is staffing or an officer. Providing that sort of accommodation is probably important to customer service, but it doesn't help or affect or improve the 508 conformance per se. One of the citations I'm going to mention here is the University of Maryland's Trace Center, in particular, what they call easy access, easy being one word, easy access. That's the approach that they've been researching, developing, working with manufacturers on for a number of years, documenting that it's reasonable working. And my next slide is an example from Astria Technologies, where they use the easy access keyboard, and they even have one on their homepage of the global entry kiosk on their frequently asked questions page. So slide 49, next slide. So I have a photograph here of the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection global entry kiosk. And I'm hoping we get some questions in the at the end of the program, because our own Brooke Atkins was intimately involved with causing this kiosk to be accessible and brought out into the real world. In particular, I'm going to highlight the brightly colored keypad in the lower right-hand screen. You can tell that that's within reach. It's above the bright green light. There's like a little blue diamond button and a couple white left and white arrows and a yellow up and down arrow. Not in great detail, because I'm going to show that on this very next slide, slide 50. So this is an example of the Storm Audio Nav keypad. So this is a more modern implementation of that same idea with the easy access approach. So you've got a 4-button keypad, up, down, left, right. In the center of that keypad is an activate button. And then the other 2 features I'll mention is kind of a help or a content or a context specific messages on the left, which is offset and below the keypad. And then on the right-hand side is an audio jack for a headphone. And one of the things they're now doing that kind of adopted this from the best practices that are working well for ATMs and fair vending machines is when you insert a headphone jack into that hole, it automatically activates the speech mode. So it's a kind of a natural way to get speech output and get the speech started without having to do anything in particular to initiate the speech mode. Next, slide 51. Now, one of the most important examples, or the important things in my example here, is again, I have a photograph of the audio nav controller, this time in a portrait orientation to the lower left. Someone's working it above the photograph over that. You can see a headphone coming out of the customer's ear that she's got plugged into the system. And then on the screen, we've got a blow up of the entrees being listed at this restaurant. And my call out box here says orange chicken, item 1 of 9, press the middle key to activate. So the important thing with this, and really the most important thing with trying to have a good speech output system, is having the tight coordination between what is being spoken and what is going on the screen. Next slide, slide 52. So I'll also point out that, yes, we've got the 508 requirements in 2017 for accessible kiosks that are purchased by federal agencies. But that's not the only one. The first one I've listed here is the 2010 Department of Justice ADA accessibility guidelines. Again, the Access Board intimately involved with developing those. There we could talk about self-service transaction machines as the term of art, and it's section 707, automatic teller machines and fair vending machines. And the URL for that is access-dashboard.gov/ADA/pound ADA-707. In 2013, the Department of Transportation updated the Air Carrier Access Act amendments, ACAA. They promulgated a regulation called Accessibility of Websites and Automated Kiosks at U.S. Airports. And then again, requirements closely developed from what we had with ATMs we were working on at the time for 508. And the Federal Register, the quickest way to bring that up is at federalregister.gov. They have a short URL form. So that's federalregister.gov/D/2013-26749. And fourth, finally, again, 508 would be third, is recently there was the Department of Veterans Affairs Website Accessibility Act of 2019. It's in the 116th Congress, Public Law 213 is the best way to try and look that up. And it covers a kiosk at a medical facility of the VA. So the initial report from that statute is due in September 2021. It's too soon for some implementing regulation. But again, it'll probably, the basic idea is that kiosks should be accessible to everyone. So I would expect a great deal of compatibility between the requirements they end up with and what we have under 508 and with the Air Carrier Access Act and with the DOJ accessibility guidelines. I'll mention also here that if you want to know what agencies are doing around kiosks, including the Access Board, including the Department of Justice, including the VA, the best way to track that is reginfo.gov, all one word, reginfo.gov, and look for something called the Unified Agenda. That is the way agencies make clear to OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, that they are working on regulatory activities. Next slide, slide 53. So now I would like to focus on here. We've been talking about kiosks. We've been talking about these other, some more interesting examples that Kathy covered. And one of the things that comes up quite a bit, we have under closed functionality, is this whole idea of, well, a mobile phone's closed functionality typically. And so many of the requirements that we would have for a kiosk, also closed functionality, would be very awkward to try and do on something that's much smaller than a kiosk. So there's exceptions in the 508 regulations for devices for personal use. And I'll mention the one about 402, about Braille instructions for initiating the speech mode. Devices for personal use shall not be required to conform to 402.2.5, which makes perfect sense. You're not gonna have a line of Braille on a cell phone, just not enough space. Now, I suppose one could, assert fundamental alteration that the cell phone has to be small enough to fit in your pocket. It would be a fundamental alteration to try and make that phone big enough to stick some a line of a Braille sentence on there. But we knew these exceptions were going to be used all the time for things like mobile phones. So that's why you'll find it here. What we call out is devices for personal use. And then another one, devices for personal use within controls that are audibly discernible without activation and operable by touch shall not be required to conform to 407.3 under input controls. So that's how 508 permits a touchscreen on a cell phone. Apple proved conclusively that you could have a mobile phone that was pretty much only used, the only discernible part was a touchscreen, and it has a great deal of user acceptance with their voiceover and their iOS. So that was with the old standard, with the original 508 standards, that would have been something called equivalent facilitation. With the revised 508 standards, you can make that kind of access mode directly and be directly conforming with 508 because a cell phone is a device for personal use. Let's go to slide 54. Talk about mobile phones. Again, no heading in the 508 hardware section for kiosks, no heading for mobile phones. These are all grouped in to the same idea of self-contained closed functionality. We're addressing a broad range of hardware with our requirements. So, not just cell phones, but the kiosks, printers, self-service copiers. So the discriminating, the main way these are discriminated is about these exceptions for personal use. And my third example here, devices for personal use shall not be conformed to 415 for providing captioning and audio description controls if they use the platform settings. So cell phones, modern cell phones nowadays, modern cell phone operating systems have a system-wide means for providing captioning. So you don't need the phone to do that on its own or in a special way. You just need to use the one that's relied upon by the operating system. So one more thing I want to say about the devices for personal use. We get a question about, well, why is that even mentioned? Devices for personal use, it's government furnished equipment, GFE, if you've heard that term. You know, the federal government is buying, procuring, maintaining these things. Nothing's for personal use. We don't have an exotic definition of devices for personal use. The preamble talks about it a little bit. It just means things that are assigned to a single individual, like your cell phones. So there's not an exception for mobile phones. There's an exception for mobile phones from these three provisions. So yes, even though they're individually assigned and they're tiny, they're small, there are some exceptions that apply to those, some of the requirements, but they're otherwise very well covered by the 508 requirements. Next slide, please. So I also want to give a little bit of a picture about autonomous vehicles. Let's take a look at mostly because we're doing a forum. We've had 2 sessions at this point. We're having another one in a couple weeks, and our fourth and final session 2 weeks after that. Please go to access-dashboard/AV, where we're talking about, just having a discussion about the accessibility of autonomous vehicles. So the next 2 sessions focus on passengers with sensory and cognitive disabilities, April 7th and 21st, 2 to 3:30 Eastern time. But the main thing I wanted to point out, Kathy talked about trucks not being, as fancy as they are, they're not covered by Section 508. They're not ICT. What I want to highlight on this slide is that if you look at the action verbs from that Klinger-Cohen definition of IT, the truck has technology that's doing many of these action verbs: storage, analysis, evaluation, manipulate, management, movement, control. And in particular, like the vehicular dashboard is, visually summarizing all these things up. All of that data and information is just totally peripheral to the principal function, of driving. But the question becomes a lot more interesting if there's no one driving, because then things like time on route, when do I get there, what's my rate of fuel consumption, be it battery or gas, is there construction going on, where am I on my route? So all of those kinds of questions are of interest not just to the driver but every passenger. So I think there's going to be, I would expect that in the next, several years, lots of interesting questions about autonomous vehicles and if they're covered by the Klinger-Cohen definition of information technology. Next slide, slide 56. So I'm going to give very short thrift to the next portion of our program here, but I do need to spend some time talking about software. Slide 57. Some of the questions we get are really discerning between software versus web content. For web content, when do I use Chapter 5? When can I only use WCAG? There's this interesting exception in 501. What does that mean? And is WCAG 2.0 really enough? And when is it enough? So let's go to that. Next slide, 58. So the scope, the exception is there about web applications do not have access to platform accessibility services. So by design, your software, your web browser does not have access to platform accessibility services. The whole idea was to keep web browsers isolated from from the operating system. So there is an exception for those kinds of software that they only need to apply to WCAG 2.0. But I would note that the phrasing is such that the exception is only allowed if your web application is already 508 conforming or already WCAG conforming. Next slide, 59. We get questions about nowadays about desktop apps versus web apps. Most of the software developers are trying to make their web versions of their software look like the desktop versions of the software. They're trying to erase the visual distinction. So maybe that you can't even tell. Well, if it is a web app, if you're really in your browser, it's only WCAG 2 level AA that you need to be confirmed with as a developer in terms of what's 508 conforming or not. For other if it's really your online application, there will be some additional requirements that are spelled out in Chapter 5. And I want to remind folks that with original 508, we have these distinctions between applets and plugins and embedded apps. None of those things, characterizations, or you can't draw the lines for those characterizations. And WCAG 2.0 was written from the ground up, not to care about what's an app or a plugin or embed. It works really well for all kinds of web content, and it works well enough, very well for for software generally. Next slide, 60. So again, this is the interesting exception that web apps that don't have access to platform services shall not be required to conform to 502, 503. 502 is interoperability with assisted technology. That's really hard for web application to do. 503 is some additional requirements for applications. And again, generally not applicable if it doesn't have access to platform services. 504 authoring tools might apply because 504 is all about developing PDFs and other documents, like other electronic documents. Slide 61, please. So need to call out what are accessibility services. So those are tools that are provided by the platform developer. They're pretty well documented as if you're an accessibility services or not. And one of the requirements talks about it being a documented accessibility service. At the end of this deck, Brooke's going to take us through some resources where we mention some of these. What do we mean by platform software and services for accessibility services? Slide 62. Mentioned there is a section 503 on authoring tools for content creation or editing. That authoring tools shall provide a mode of operation to create or edit content that conforms to level A and AA success criteria and conformance requirements. So if your software or your web application is an authoring tool, it's required to be able to make accessible documents. There's one for prompts and also one for templates underneath this. Slide 63. We got a question about, well, what's the PDF requirement? It literally says authoring tools capable of exporting PDF files that conform to ISO 32000-1:2008 PDF 17 shall also be capable of exporting PDF files that conform to ANSI/AIM/ISO 14289-:2016 PDF UA incorporated by reference and the site there. Let me just give you the same paraphrase, which I also have on the slide. If, and it's an if your authoring tool can export modern PDFs, modern PDF being a PDF 1.7, the last, the most current version of ISO of what Adobe before they turned it over to AIM says is what is a PDF. So a modern PDF. If your tool can do a modern PDF, it also needs to be able to do PDFs that conform to this other standard, PDF UA. So PDFs that do 1.7 need to also be able to do PDF UA. And I note here that PDF UA is a subset of PDF 1.7. So it's just a little bit more attention to details. So if you're talk to your product developer or your salesman, does it do PDF? Everything does PDF export, right? So what version of PDF? And can it do PDF UA if it's the modern version of PDFs? Next slide, 64. I want to remind folks that you can go beyond the minimum. The question is that what about WCAG 2.1? What about AAA requirements? Is WCAG 2.0 what I really need to worry about? Yes, in the federal space. That's the bare minimum requirement. However, you're certainly welcome and encouraged to go beyond that. So WCAG 2.0 level AA is enough. There are places already looking at WCAG 2.1. WCAG 2.2 will be out. The way the W3C is writing those more updated versions of WCAG, they're totally backwards compatible. So you can only pay attention to 2.1. It'll have some things in it that are very helpful for accessibility that are not required for 508, but well worth working at. Next slide, 65. Two examples from WCAG 2.1 about having character key shortcuts and about a requirement for non-text contrast. I'm going to give short thrift to the rest of the slides in my deck here. Slide 66. I want to talk about graphical apps. One of the questions we have kind of generally phrased is something like, Photoshop or an image editing tool or a photograph manipulation tool or maybe some other high-end graphics package. There's no way for somebody who is totally blind, totally unable to see, that person is not going to go do a good job with image editing. How can 508 require that person work that software? Well, 508 doesn't require that. 508 merely requires what WCAG requires, which is to say that the minimal bar of accessibility for something like that is actually pretty low. And I'll explain why that is. So slide 67. So this kind of comes up with things like maps and graphical information system and webcams and drawing and painting applications. So the WCAG 2.0 success criteria have typically, well, you call them inline exceptions. I call them here caveats. So conforming with the accessibility standards doesn't guarantee that somebody who cannot meaningfully use that particular application can, if they can't see. I mean, but the 508 requirements do have some expectation for the accessibility, and they're important. Slide 68. The two I'm going to mention here is 1.1.1. Non-text content has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. That's a very high bar, and that's the general requirement. But there's a pretty big, I'll say caveat again, a pretty big exception for sensory experience. If non-text content is primarily intended to provide a specific sensory experience, then text alternatives at least provide descriptive identification of the non-text content. And there's a photograph here of maybe a meteor passing through some alien landscape. Arts and photographs are examples of providing sensory experience. So if there's, you need the descriptive identification, the text label, but not the text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. Descriptive identification is important and meaningful, and but it's not impossible is the main thing. Descriptive identification. I've never seen a situation where descriptive identification was an unreasonable requirement. Next slide, 69. The other big thing is about the keyboard accessibility. It's got some, again, this is quote out of WCAG, and it's got an interesting caveat, except where the underlying function requires input that depends on the path of the user's movement and not just the endpoints. So that kind of thing is like painting or maybe flying a drone, where how you're working the pointing device, the mouse, the cursor, the augmented reality controller is just as important as it's not just where the click or the selection stops. It's how you get from one spot to another. Slide 70. Next slide. And I'm pass it over to Brooke.
Thanks, Bruce. This is Brooke Aiken. I am the ACOP Co-Education Chair. Let's get started with questions and answers.
Thank you all. This presentation was fantastic today. Unfortunately, we are unable to take any live questions submitted through the Q&A box this afternoon, but continue to submit your questions to the email 508@accessdashboard.gov, and they will be answered. Today, we're going to do some pre-submitted questions that were submitted before today's webinar. The first question is for Tim. Tim, does 508 apply to nonprofits and state agencies? Who does 508 apply to?
Thank you, Brooke. This is Tim. The short answer is no. And the reason we know that is because in Chapter 1, E101 purpose, it says that Section 508 applies to federal agencies, which are defined in the definitions. Entities under the Americans with Disabilities Act have been applying Section 508 standards to their online content, and that is best addressed by the Department of Justice. Questions should be directed to ada.gov, and the numbers are 1-800-514-0301 for voice, 1-800-514-0383 for TTYs. Thank you, Brooke.
Thanks, Tim. The next pre-submitted question I'm going to give to Kathy. Kathy, does 508 apply to lab equipment?
Thanks, Brooke. So as we've gone through our presentation today, the first thing to try to figure out when you're determining 508 applicability is if it's ICT. And we've put up the definition of ICT in several places in our presentation deck. But if you look at the definition of ICT, it's ICT. ICT is IT and several other factors. And when you look at the definition of IT and compare it to what lab equipment is, you'll find that lab equipment is for analysis, evaluation, manipulation, and display of information and data. So yes, generally lab equipment is considered IT and therefore covered by Section 508.
Thank you, Kathy. The last question that we will ask today is for Bruce. Bruce, we had a lot of kiosk questions this afternoon. Your question that was pre-submitted is, does having a fast food employee help a customer use the ordering kiosk satisfy accessibility? So does having a person at the kiosk satisfy accessibility?
So I meant to tie my slide. Hi, this is Bruce. I meant to tie my slide 49 and 52 more closely to this question. With those examples, with the global entry kiosk, with ATMs, how ridiculous would it be to have a teller out at the ATM? That was probably proposed early on. With 508 kiosks, none of those provide for having an attendee, an attendant, a officer, a operator, a personal assistant. None of those regulations allow that kind of accommodation as an alternative to providing an accessible kiosk. Now, can't say what's going to happen with, say, checkout machines or self-service kiosks at restaurants and such. The jury's still out on that one, kind of literally. But again, with the examples that we already have, no, that's not good enough. Oh, and if I can, I want to ping on, I saw a lot of questions about, these cars, they have IT in them. There's a display screen, yes, that was kind of my point with the AV forums, which we're hoping you'll attend. There's lots of IT in modern cross-country trucks that Kathy gave the example of, but we don't regard them as being ICT. But again, it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce, Kathy, and Tim.
Next slide. Slide 71 is resources and contact information. Next slide. Slide 70, I think we skipped a slide. Slide 73, resources. So if you want to learn more about the revised 508 standards from 2017, those are the latest, go to the Access Board homepage, then move to Guidelines and Standards at the top menu, and then scroll to ICT 508 and section 255. The web address is www.access-board.gov/ICT. You can also find more information on section 508.gov. The WCAG 2.0 conformance requirements from 2008 can be found at www.w3.org/TR/WCAG 20. And you'll find Understanding WCAG 2.0 and Techniques for WCAG 2.0 under that website URL. The W3C website accessibility initiative can be found at www.w3.org/WAI. Next slide. As promised, which was mentioned on slide 61, here are some resources of examples of platform accessibility services. Accessibility in Windows 10, I'm going to read a quote. Build accessibility into your applications to empower people of all abilities. More information about Windows accessibility can be found at http://docs.microsoft.com/en-us/apps/accessibility. If you want information on accessibility for developers in an Apple platform, go to http://developer.apple.com/accessibility. If you would like information on development within the Android platform, please go to Build More Accessible Apps at http://developer.android.com/guide/topics/UI/accessibility. Next slide. For more information, contact us. Please send an email to 508@access-board.gov. You can call at 202-272-0080 or 1-800-872-2253. If you're using a TTY, please call at 202-272-0082 or 1-800-993-2822. Next slide. Thanks so much for participating in today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you at our next session, which is May 25th, 2021. The title of May's session is Section 508 Compliance and Assistive Technology, Providing Accessibility to ICT for Federal Employees under the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 and Section 508. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, and that concludes today's session. At this time, you may close out your browser and/or use the Leave button to exit today's program. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.